Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Feeling Smarter. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Tim Miller. G'day, Tim. How are you?
Yeah, going pretty well, Aaron. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. Well, today we're going to talk about the topic of borrowing, and we ordinarily know that there is a prohibition on borrowing, and we commonly talk about in our industry the exception around limited recourse borrowing arrangements. Today's focus, though, is really to look into Section 67 and more specifically some of the exceptions around the ability to temporarily borrow. So, can I get you, Tim, just to, I guess, set the scene around what Section 67 tells us and then what we have available to us around the temporary borrowing provisions?
Yeah, so look, Section 67 is one of the many investment restriction provisions within the SIS Act that prohibits certain behaviours by trustees and then goes on to make exceptions to those prohibitions. And so it's very clear cut. Superannuation funds cannot borrow.
Yep.
Except, and then of course we then had the bigger exception of the limited recourse borrowing arrangements, which of course wasn't always there. That's actually the newest addition to the Section 67 area. But we had sort of previously three sort of primary borrowing exceptions, and I kind of feel these days that you can summarise it as two, because one of those three was related to the payment of surcharge under the
Yes.
old superannuation surcharge requirements. And the super surcharge sort of went by the by, well, so 15 years ago, 20 years, it's quite some
Yeah.
time ago now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It seemed to
so,
drag on a while, but
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I think you'd think now that most of those surcharge assessments have been collected or they've given up.
You'd certainly want to hope, because that was one of the, and I know that's not what today's talk is about, but that was one of the crazy things about surcharges, the liability. You could avoid it by rolling your money elsewhere, and then they used to have to issue another assessment to you.
Yeah.
But which I think they learned about for many of the other release authorities since. But
Yeah.
the key to the Section 67, one of the big keys to Section 67 is that it's a prohibition to borrow in one instance. But then what they also do is then they add this additional clause in there, which is also, it's a prohibition to maintain an existing borrowing. So
Mm.
so not only do you then have or you don't have the issue of breaching in 1 year and then going, well, I breached, but it's in there now. From an audit point of view, it should be reviewed each year. And if the borrowing
Yeah.
hasn't been repaid or whatever, then you are maintaining an existing borrowing, and that is also a breach. So it's kind of well worded in that sense to stop not only the initial behaviour, but then any sort of maintenance of that behaviour beyond the first point.
Yeah. So I guess as you touched on, there's really two key areas.
Yep.
So one is around, I guess the first one we'll touch on is around settlement of certain investments
Yep.
inside the SMSF. So can I get you to elaborate on what the qualifications are as to
Yep.
where that exception will apply?
Yeah, so that first one, as you allude to there, is the settlement of investment transactions, and there's a whole lot of investments listed within 67, and the primary one is like the shares in a company,
Yep.
units in unit trust. So basically, ultimately, for most self-managed super funds, it's kind of that whole listed acquisition transaction. So, or the acquisition of shares or units in an investment vehicle, investment company. You've got 7 days.
Mm-hmm.
So you can borrow. You can borrow up to an amount of 10% of the total value of the fund's asset, and the period of borrowing is restricted to 7 days. Now,
And that's not business days. That's 7 days.
yeah, and it's also, again, quite specific. This piece of legislation is, it says that at the time you made the investment decision, that the fund had the capacity to pay. So again, a lot of that was drawn from the fact that particularly in the old days of, say, trading, where you had this trade plus 3 days, this
Mm.
concept T plus three, and other things similarly, was that at the time that you did the transaction, you had the money, and then a fee comes out or something else comes out of the fund, and you don't have the money any longer for whatever purposes, and so you needed to do a short-term borrowing. to rectify that situation, and then you cleared that situation out within a week. So it really is a short-term solution, and to be honest, it's one of those solutions that I've very rarely seen come into fruition with regards to self-managed superannuation funds versus, say, the other borrowing exception, which is more around benefit payments.
Yeah, so the benefit payments one here, I've seen used more often myself as well, and I might sort of jump into that in a second, but what are the conditions here where we can borrow for the purposes of dealing with the benefit payment that might need to be made?
Yeah, so the one with benefit payments is ultimately that if the trustee has an obligation, either under the law or under the governing rules, so under the deed, to pay a benefit to the members, to the beneficiaries, and they don't have the capacity to do that, then once again we have a capacity to borrow up to 10% of the total assets of the fund, but we have 90 days to repay that amount. So if we need to do a benefit payment, we can borrow up to 10% and we can pay that back within 3 months. So assuming like we've got a pension liability, even, you're probably not going to have this when you're talking 10%, but relationship breakdowns where you have an obligation to pay money elsewhere, partial payment of a death benefit, something like that might be required. So
I've seen a practical case at 30 June just gone, where in essence, we had a fund that had 2 individual trustees in the fund. One of those members passed away, and of course, the minimum payment hadn't been made for that year. And as a result of one of those individuals passing away, the bank account got frozen. So the ability to make that pension payment within a reasonable time. Fortunately, they actually ended up having 2 bank accounts running in the fund, but there wasn't sufficient cash in one of those. So one of them was still operative and the other one had been frozen. So therefore, to ensure that that minimum pension obligation was made available for that year, we needed to, in essence, put in place a temporary borrowing to allow for that minimum pension obligation to be made, which therefore entitled the funds to gain the ECPI for that year, and then ultimately not only that year, but then potentially for the part of the subsequent year, as we know in the Commissioner's revised views in TR 2013-5. So that's something that we would see more and more often now in terms of clients that are aging clients that we're hitting these roadblocks in respect to death, maybe incapacity or whatever the case may be. So that it's a really timely reminder to note that we do have that opportunity available to you, but noting the limitations around the 10% and the time frame to get that money back is crucial.
Yeah, and probably what I would finish with in regards to it, and again, the referencing that often it's benefit payment list, benefit payment subject to pension minimum requirements, and often you'll hear it because people are, they're waiting for a term deposit to mature or something else like that might be the reason that they don't have the liquidity on that given day to be able to make the full payment out there. One of the other things to be mindful of is that elsewhere, and there's been a tax ruling on borrowings and the structure of borrowings from the tax office back in 2009. But one of the key things is the commerciality. Now that we have driven further down the path of non-arm's length income and non-arm's length expenditure and other things, that really ensuring that people contemplate the commerciality of any borrowing arrangement that they might create within the fund, and certainly that's going to come down to how far into the 90 days or how far along do you need to get that payment made. So always make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's with regards to it actually being a genuine borrowing arrangement.
Yeah, and I think that's the most crucial bit to this, is that you do understand that we work with an environment where borrowing is not allowed. And then, as you said, within that investment restriction, we do have available to us some exceptions, but they are very prescriptive in how you can take advantage of them. And therefore, understanding how you need to work within the construct of that is really important, but also knowing those to take advantage of them when you may need to is certainly something that us as SMSF professionals should note. and take advantage of when and where possible.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you once again for your time, Tim.
Always a pleasure.
And we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care and bye for now.
Bye.